With the number of coronavirus cases outside of China on the rise,
it's what's happening in the rest of the world that's now our greatest concern.
And the amount of confusion around the disease spreading.
The trajectory of what we're looking at over the weeks and months ahead is very uncertain.
The death rate, or what we call the case fatality rate, is about 2%, 2.5%. Whether that's the most accurate, we don't know.
The ripple effects are being seen everywhere, from the stock market to our nation's capital.
What is certain here is that there's just no time for politics. Diseases don't know party lines, and I would imagine members of Congress would drop the partisanship to coordinate efforts on keeping our country safe.
How prepared is Arizona to fight against the coronavirus? That's all ahead on Politics Unplugged.
And good evening, I'm political editor Dennis Welch. This is Politics Unplugged, and the uncertainty over the spread of the coronavirus is rattling the markets. The Dow has plunged 4,000 points in the last 5 trading days, and President Trump says the risk of Americans getting infected is low. He led an effort this week to show his administration is prepared.
We're very, very ready for this, for anything.
Flanked by health officials, the president said his administration has plans in place for a worst-case scenario, including stockpiling protective equipment and masks.
Every aspect of our society should be prepared.
And President Trump said Vice President Mike Pence will head the task force responsible for monitoring the outbreak and coordinating with local officials across the country on their response to the virus.
I look forward, Mr. President, to serving in this role.
Health officials agreed with the president that the aggressive strategy so far had been working, but were cautionary about the future.
We can expect to see more cases in the United States.
Moments later, the president contradicted that.
I don't think it's inevitable.
And then there were other contradictions on how soon a vaccine might be available.
The vaccine is coming along well, and in speaking to the doctors, we think this is something that we can develop fairly rapidly.
Although this is the fastest we have ever gone from a sequence of a virus to a trial, it still would not be any applicable to the epidemic unless we really wait about a year to a year and a half.
Health officials say prevention is crucial.
We don't have any natural immunity, we don't have a vaccine, and we don't have antivirals to treat this. So really, right now, prevention is ounce of cure.
But the administration has been criticized for cutting funding that had been dedicated to coordinating government responses to a public health crisis.
What he's doing is late, too late, anemic. Hopefully we can make up for the loss of time.
And joining me now for more insights on how prepared Arizona is for the coronavirus is the former head of the State Department of Health, Will Humble. Mr. Humble, thank you very much for taking some time to come here and talk to us. And I guess the first question everybody wants to know is, how prepared is Arizona? Is Arizona ready to deal with this potential epidemic?
Yeah, so there are a host of public health preparedness plans in place, and they've been in place for many years. We actually published our first pandemic readiness plan in 2008. And so really it's a matter of executing those plans in a responsible manner and having the right people in the right jobs to make good decisions as this pandemic progresses. And make no mistake, we will have community spread here in Arizona. It's just a matter of time. Those preparedness plans are in place. There's a strategic national stockpile, as was just mentioned. And so it's about executing those plans and making good decisions, really.
What's the first part of this plan? You can hear all about, we've got these plans, but some specifics. We talked earlier in the week, we talked a little bit about lab capacity, the ability to be able to test for coronavirus on the ground here in Arizona. What's happening right now, and do we have that capacity?
Yeah, so if I was in my old job, one of the first things I'd want to know right now is, when can we get the diagnostic test to our Arizona State Laboratory? Right now, if a clinician out in the field at a hospital has a patient and they want to test them for the coronavirus, they're going to have to send that to CDC. It takes days now. It's going to take a lot longer if they don't get this together. So the first thing I would like to get is that test here in Arizona so we could have a better turnaround time. I saw an email yesterday suggesting that we should be able to have that test at our state laboratory in Arizona by next week, Monday. So hopefully that's the case, because it's going to become very important very soon.
Is it possible then now that people could be infected with that coronavirus in Arizona and it's not being diagnosed?
Right, because right now we have a limited testing capacity. Remember, all the samples have to go to CDC. So the protocol right now is to just test people with symptoms or travel history or contract with somebody who has travel history to the infected areas. And so it's very limited in terms of the number of people who have been tested. So it's very possible there could be community coronavirus in other parts of the country right now. And that's why it's so important to get a diagnostic test out there so that we can have a better picture of where the virus actually is.
All right, now I want to play some sound now from our governor. He's been asked about this a lot here in the past few days. And let's take a listen to what Governor Ducey had to say.
We want to be prepared, and we are prepared. I'm being briefed every day on this from our Department of Health Services. Was actually back in Washington, D.C., and had the Centers for Disease Control, National Institute of Health, and Department of Homeland Security brief all the nation's governors on where we are. And they consider the risk at this time low for Arizona, and it's low in the United States, but we have seen the outbreak around the globe. So what I think we want to be is prepared. We can hope for the best, but we need to be prepared for the worst. And we do have immense authorities if there were to be a worst case scenario, which I think is where many folks in reporting have already jumped to.
How far does your authority go? Can you set cities into quarantine? Can you shut down schools? What can you do?
We can quarantine individuals and people that won't cooperate. Of course, public health and public safety is the reason we have a governor and a government that exists. So yes, in that type of scenario, there would be announcements and actions, and we've done the exercises to plan ahead.
A little bit to unpack there, but let's start with the fact, again, here the governor's saying we hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Given the fact that we just talked about, the labs, the local lab testing isn't available yet, and it could be days away or whatnot, is Arizona prepared to handle this?
Well, if we get the test and we have enough capacity in the coming days, then that part will be taken care of. The other pieces to this are hospital preparedness, and so ensuring that we have good inventory tracking at the hospitals for personal protective equipment for the staff, making sure that they're aware of the regulatory waivers that they might be asking for in the coming weeks. Conserving PPE or personal protective equipment is an important component as well. And so there's some of those hospital preparedness questions in place. And then finally, it's time right now, even though we don't have community spread right now, it's time to start thinking about the merits or the risk benefits of doing sort of these community interventions that you heard the CDC talk about around school closure and so forth. And, I have a pretty strong opinion about that, when you start closing schools, you really have to be sure that the benefits are worth the cost, because it's very disruptive to people's families. And the benefits are really suspect.
Yeah. Again, you heard the governor in there. He said that he does have the authority to quarantine communities and whatnot. You're kind of against some of these moves, aren't you?
Well, I'm against doing community interventions that do more harm than good. And in my opinion, things like school closures, or as CDC suggested last weekend, closing businesses and that kind of thing, that does more harm than good, in my opinion. But you're right. There is already in state law provisions whereby the governor could, through an executive order, enhance the authority for isolation and quarantine. But fortunately, that law also contains due process, so it's not an unlimited exercise of authority of the state.
All right, let's move on now. Let's talk a little bit about ways to maybe prevent some of this stuff. Now, there are three different ASU researchers tackling the challenge of creating a vaccine to prevent the coronavirus. We're told that the earliest that one could be available to develop the vaccine was by the end of the summer, and with it taking possibility of years to approve the vaccine. That time frame we were given seems to go against what the president said on Wednesday.
The vaccine is coming along well, and in speaking to the doctors, we think this is something that we can develop fairly rapidly, a vaccine for the future.
Care to respond to that? He thinks it seemed that we can do this pretty quickly.
Well, we can do this more quickly than we ever have been able to before because of technological improvements. It's true that by, the summer, there could be a vaccine that would be ready for trial, but then you have to test it for both safety and efficacy, which means does it work. If the vaccine is in good shape and does work and the trials are successful, we could have a vaccine by this time next year. But, for this initial wave, which is coming, by the way, and yes, the risk is low right now, but there is going to be community spread. There won't be a vaccine available, just like H1N1. If you remember back in 2009, we didn't have a vaccine until late October, really November that year. So there are many months without a vaccine.
All right, and just real quick, maybe explain real quick, this isn't exactly a death sentence if you get this, correct? I mean, it's a little bit more harsh than the flu, but maybe not, something to completely panic about, or?
No, I agree. I think this is very analogous to H1N1 if you remember back in 2009. The data that's coming out now from China is, we don't have a lot of time here, but I just have to say, I don't think it's nearly as lethal as the data suggests coming out of China.
All right, thanks a lot. It's Will Humble. Thank you very much for spending some time here with us.
And I would like to make a motion to approve Model B.
I'll second that, Mayor.
And that city council vote means more oversight is coming to the Phoenix Police Department. We're talking to the council member that opposed the new Civilian Review Board, and that's next here on Politics Unplugged.
Down the ground! Bunker! Push past it! Push past it! Hands on! Hands on!
Quit walking!
Get out the car!
Stephen Park, step. I'm gonna put it.
Don't!
And welcome back to Politics Unplugged. Incidents like that over the last few years have sparked calls for more oversight of the Phoenix Police Department. And this past week, the City Council did just that, approving a plan for a Civilian Review Board. Now, the council had two options to choose from. Model A would have included civilian members who can monitor investigations into police misconduct. Model B would have allowed civilian members to be more actively involved in those investigations. After hours of debate, the council voted in favor of so-called Model B, bringing in civilians to have influence over investigations alleging officer misconduct. The council agreed they want a board that will follow rules to respect everyone's rights. And joining me now is City Councilman Jim Waring, who voted against the Civilian Review Board. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Let's start off by saying you saw the beginning of this segment. There's been a lot of incidents of police shootings a few years ago. We broke records here. Why did you vote against the Civilian Review Board?
I think it's $2 million spent on a very redundant board. There are already the Use of Force Board, the Disciplinary Review Board. Citizens participate on those. This is going to create a dual track system where the chief is going to get two different recommendations. I don't see how unity is achieved by having two different recommendations from two different boards if they disagree. I just think the $2 million could have been spent paying down pension debt, hiring more officers, and it's another layer of bureaucracy. If citizens are wondering, what do I get out of this? It's another layer of bureaucracy to make even more of a jumble of this process than maybe perhaps it already is, and I think it's unfair to the officers.
But you heard, you heard in that meeting, there's a lot of mistrust with the police department right now. Adding us to some civilian oversight, though, don't you think that will restore some trust back into the police department? There were a lot of people obviously very upset with the way that Phoenix police have been conducting business.
Define a lot. There is 1.6 million Phoenicians. There were 100 people or so in that room. I'm not saying every incident, as you showed earlier, goes perfectly. City of Phoenix police contact about 1 million plus people a year. Front and center, only a few thousand of those turn out to be actual arrests. They do a lot of good work in the community. I think it's unfair to focus on a few incidences that maybe didn't go perfectly. I would also respectfully point out the word community gets thrown around a lot. There might be some mistrust among individuals, but when I knock on doors in my district, I don't hear that mistrust. People are very supportive of the police, as am I.
Some folks would say, particularly from that meeting, the different parts of town. You live up in northern Phoenix, very different community, much more trusting of the police down there. There are parts of the city that they don't have that kind of trust.
That's a fair point, and I've made that point myself at council meetings, and I've talked about that with members who represent the southern part of the city. But I will say this, to make blanket statements on comments that were made at one or a handful of council meetings, I think is unfair when you're talking about the 1.5 million Phoenicians who seem to be pretty satisfied with the services. We've done polling in the past, not political polling, but the city has done polling. Trust of the police was high, or certainly satisfaction with police was high. People seem to want more officers, at least that's what I hear. You make a point, but I will say I don't believe necessarily the people in that room were representing every opinion south of, say, Northern or something either. I don't think that's a fair statement.
So let's move on to, we were talking a little bit before the show, there were two plans before the council. You weren't going to vote for any of them. Why?
No. Again, $2 million. We've got a lot of needs. We have extreme pension debt. We already have groups that look at this. So one of the items that was brought up, one of the incidents that was brought up, the officer was acquitted. It was cleared. I mean, it's still an officer. So at some point, the jurors are citizens. Don't they count? But I think really what we're trying to do here, not me, but I think generally speaking as a council, is set up a system where eventually you get the result that you want. And I don't think that's fair to the officers to go through so many different steps in the process. There are several different, and whenever force is used, there are several different steps in this process. Citizens are involved. I don't know why people say that's not.
Well, then let me say that there are other communities, other cities, large cities in this country that have civilian review boards. Why is it a good idea for them, a bad idea for Phoenix?
There are a lot of ideas in other cities, light rail would be one example, that maybe don't work here. And so I would say our police force is well respected. We hear that from departments around the country. The professionalism of our officers is fantastic. When you have 1 million+ interactions every year, something is going to go wrong. And some of those, particularly when you throw a lot of weapons, when you look at the shootings, a lot of those were people in the commission of violent crimes or shooting at the officers or what have you. What are the officers supposed to do?
Now, final question here. It still needs to be implemented at this point.
Yes.
How are you going to engage with this implementation?
Well, that's another reason. That was another reason to vote no. It is not fleshed out how this is actually going to work. The staff is now unclear. There were two different plans, one put forth by the mayor and really the staff, and then the other was not, and that's the one that passed. So they're aware of the plans. They knew the potential was there, but there's definitely going to be a lot more work to be done before this is implemented, so there is going to be a delay. The fairest thing would have been to put something on the ballot and let citizens decide, and then we'd see what the community as a whole, the 1.6 million, actually think. Right now, that's not where we're at.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Councilman Jim Waring.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thanks for joining us here. Now, our panel is next. The countdown to the Arizona presidential preference election is on, and we're talking about that and the rest of this week's major headlines. That's ahead on Politics Unplugged.
Can you do the math for the rest of us?
How many hours do you have?
2.
That's
the problem.
No, that's not the problem. All right, let's talk about Medicare for all.
I'll tell you exactly what it adds up to. It adds up to 4 more years of Donald Trump, Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House, and the inability to get the Senate into Democratic hands.
Vladimir Putin thinks that Donald Trump should be president of the United States, and that's why Russia is helping you get elected, so you'll lose to him.
And the Democratic presidential race is intensifying ahead of next week's Super Tuesday contest in 14 states where more than 1,300 delegates are up for grabs. And the following Tuesday, March 17th, Arizona Democrats will go to the polls. Here's a look at how poll analysis site 538 is projecting the Democratic race in Arizona. They have Senator Bernie Sanders with a 28% chance of winning. The former VP Joe Biden, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Pete Buttigieg trailing behind him, with a lot of Democrats trying to stop the momentum created by Bernie Sanders early in the 2020 primary. Some are trying to preach unity if he ends up as the nominee. And it's time to talk it out with our political consultants, Tony Connie and Marcus Dellartino. Thank you very much for joining us here today. Let's start with you here, Tony. What are you seeing coming into Arizona from some of these previous contests? You think Bernie Sanders here can win Arizona, the PPE here in Arizona? And do you think he is going to bring people out to the polls and vote for him and win this state and flip it blue in November?
I think that the Sanders campaign is doing a great job. I think they have a good opportunity to bring out a lot of voters here in the state. But I think that what we're seeing is there's a real unity among Democrats to defeat Trump. That's really what's happening here. And all this fighting and all the intensity is because we have like a singular goal. And I am convinced that really any of the major potential nominees on the Democratic side can win Arizona.
Marcus?
let's look at where we are on the calendar. This weekend, we're going to go into South Carolina. Biden's expected to win. That's going to be a short media blitz for him because then we're coming into Super Tuesday and then Arizona. Biden legitimately could lock up this nomination by Super Tuesday. We're coming into Arizona. I think he's going to have the momentum behind him. I think Biden wins, but keep in mind, Bloomberg has spent more money in Arizona than you could possibly imagine. I mean, millions and millions of dollars in infrastructure in Arizona, all could be wasted because of the performance in Super Tuesday.
But considering that, we've had so many different front runners here so far early in this nominating competition here. I mean, is it likely that someone could wrap up or essentially wrap up the nomination after Super Tuesday, or have such a commanding lead that they wouldn't be able to get, nobody would be able to overtake them?
Yeah, I could see that happening, especially because the delegates are handed out in sort of a proportional manner as we go forward. And so I really am confident, though, that it's going to be there's more money. I'm struggling to say there's more money coming into the state than has ever come in here before.
Sure, I mean,
for Democrats, for Republicans, because we are probably the top 1 or 2 battleground states in the entire country. And so, it's going to be a big fight.
Yeah, and again, I want to get back to you real quick. Again, to talk to you about the Bernie Sanders thing, Joe Biden, who performs better in Arizona, who in the general election come November?
Sure, Joe Biden performs better. He translates better to Arizonans than Bernie Sanders does. It's a concern for if you just look at Arizona, then you're starting to look at down ticket races. Does Bernie bring out middle of the road voters or all the Democratic performance that you were looking for on your side? Look, the voters are going to have a very clear choice if it's Bernie Sanders versus Donald Trump. There's probably the clearest choice in history between two candidates, vastly different. The question is going to be, how does that affect the turnout model? And does that start to affect races like Mark Kelly, the state legislature? I mean, every race that is on the ballot.
And any possibility that Arizona could see some surprises here, so like Elizabeth Warren could come out on top or finish a strong second, or Pete Buttigieg? Do you see any evidence of that?
Yeah, I think it could happen. I mean, this is all really up in the air, but it is clear that Bernie Sanders has the momentum, and he also has a base of donors that's going to keep him through this contest until the end, which is a strength that he really, really has. And so regardless of the outcome in Arizona, I think that this nomination process is going to be a pretty long one for Democrats.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit. Let's switch the topic here. Let's talk about the local issue. Big news in the week: City Hall Civilian Review Board. How big of a step was this, and put this into some perspective for us?
It was a really big step. For the last 20 years, there's been calls to have some sort of civilian oversight at the police department, and the mayor took the leap. She sort of had some real political courage here and said, hey, let's have a big community conversation about this. And that culminated in this vote in the policy meeting just the other day. And so while there is a lot that needs to get done to sort of determine what the sort of final form of this is, the majority of people on that council wanted some sort of oversight, and now it's going to happen.
And Marcus, get your perspective on this. You heard Councilman Jim Waring saying that he believes this is just a big waste of resources.
Yeah, here's what I would say. If you need any evidence of how this is going to turn out, look at the Oakland model, which has turned out to be a disaster. Similar circumstances, similar process, somewhat of a disaster, and ended up in the firing of the police chief, who the mayor admittedly loved. So I do think that there is a place for an oversight mechanism. I don't think that this one was probably the right one.
All right, unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. That is all the time we have tonight, but be sure to join us next week for more Politics Unplugged.